Thus, welcome to the second part of our matinee. We will have two papers which refer to two different chronologies, but that I think have a common bulk, which is translocation. Translocation of literary themes and translocation of people across the Mediterranean Sea. The first paper is the reference to Paul's journey to the third heaven in Charles Williams Arthuriad by Sławomir Torbus of the University of Wroclaw. And the second is the development of the ecclesiastical structures and architecture in Normandy and in southern Italy and Sicily, through the activities of the Norman family of Germency by Władimir Stanislavski, which is from the Polish Academy of the Science and from the Institute of Ethnology and Archaeology of Wroclaw. Thus, without further delay, I call to the desk Torbus, which is you. Sorry, I didn't have to play that.
He can also speak in your...
Instead of...
Yeah.
Okay. Charles Williams, a British poet, novelist, playwright, theologian, literary critic, and a member of the Inklings, the informal group associated with C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien at the University of Oxford. Charles Williams was one of the best-known Inklings, apart from Lewis and Tolkien. He has been called one of the three main Christian fantasy writers in the 20th century. However, in Poland, I don't know about Italy, but Williams only recently has become a better-known figure due to the translation of one of his famous novels, War in Heaven. Still much less known is his Arthurian poetry. Within this topic, he published two books, Taliesin through Torbus in 1938, The Region of the Summer Stars, 1944, where the theme of the third heaven appears, which is of interest to us today. And in the context of today's topic, it is also worth mentioning his outstanding study on Dante, the figure of Beatrice from 1944. Williams turned out to be a recognized expert on Dante, and one can assume that this fact undoubtedly influenced the selection of specific motifs also in his Arthurian poems. It seems that of no less importance was also his theological background. In some, we can undoubtedly say that he was familiar with the world of Dante and the world of the Bible. And the aim of my today's paper is to formulate a hypothesis concerning an interpretive problem related to the sources of the third heaven motif in Williams' Arthurian text. And I'm very grateful to the organizers of the conference that I have an opportunity to share my preliminary observations on this subject. I have found two views about the origins of the third heaven motif in Williams. Gracia Elwood stated that the immediate source of this concept was simply the passage in the 2 Corinthians 12, in which the Apostle Paul recounted his journey to the third heaven. On the other hand, Karl-Heinz Geller is of the opinion that Williams followed immediately Dante, and the direct source of the third heaven motif is the medieval model of the universe composed of the spheres with the earth at its center. According to Geller, Williams' third heaven is then the sphere of Venus. However, Geller observed that Williams' description of the third heaven exhibits a certain peculiarity. Namely, it is non-spatial, which the scholar considers a conscious device of the poet. The idea seems significant, so I will return to this observation later. The difference of opinions begs the question, are there any indications that would support either of the above hypotheses in seeking the answer? Let us first look at the context in which Williams' third heaven motif appears. Then we will turn to Paul's account on his heavenly journey in the second letter to the Corinthians. In the region of the summer stars, the third heaven is mentioned for the first time in the Taliesin's song. The text you can see on the slide. And here Taliesin expresses one of many polarities in the song. The narrator is both the lowest and the highest, represented by his patron Saint Mary Magdalene, a despised sinner whose spiritual union with Christ made her a saint in glory. We can see here the paradox of the meeting of the oppositions. The third heaven is sketched in the central scene of the poem. Taliesin on the road to Byzantium, between Broceliande in the west and Logos in the east, meets Merlin and reason. Night falls and they lie down to sleep. Then the power of the third heaven is approaching earth, and Merlin seizes upon this moment to enact a magical rite. The description of the rite is very long, so I only evoke one characteristic of the third heaven that can be observed in the passage. The third heaven represents here the meeting of the many, of the polarized in oneness. Thus, this reality unites even separate times, the present and the future. Similarly, in the Taliesin through Logos, the third heaven is a place of the meeting of opposite realities, pain and pleasure, birth and death. In the chapter entitled The Son of Lancelot, Merlin carries out another magical rite. He opens 3 circles, which correspond to the 3 heavens. The third circle takes him to the third heaven, where, as the poets write, fixed is the fool. His vision focuses on the central event, the birth of Galahad. The suffering of the empire is identified with the contraction of Princess Helene's labor. Birth is connected to death. The union of the opposites is shown in the encounter of the 2 wolves, the metamorphized Lancelot and Merlin, the one seeking to devour Galahad, the other to become a cradle for him. The terrible blow that flings Lancelot several meters through the air to strike his head on the ground begins the process of returning him to human shape. Here and elsewhere in the 2 poems we are dealing with the reconciliation of opposites in the realm of the third heavens. Even the very nature of the third heaven reflects this characteristic. Let us remind ourselves here of the above-mentioned Bielsa observation that the third heaven is non-spatial. It is imagined as a sphere surrounding the earth, but at the same time it is asserted to be not in space, a paradox. Let's verify if this paradoxical view of the third heaven is, as Goethe claimed, the pure invention of Williams, or can it be somehow related to the description of Paul's vision in the 2nd Corinthians? Before analyzing the text of the interest, it's helpful to recall briefly the context of the letter. The letter was written between 54 and 57 and was caused by the problems of Paul, whose apostolic authority was being challenged in Corinth because of the appearance in the local Christian community the teachers, which the apostle himself calls false apostles. Their attacks caused Paul to change his plans for his visit to Corinth. And in the first part of the text, chapters 1 to 7, the apostle explains the reasons for the change of plans. Then, in chapters 8 and 9, he raises problems concerning the preparation of the visit and the collection of the money for the poor in Jerusalem. And in the third part, chapters 10 to 13, he confronts the false apostles. Reading the letter, one gets the impression that in the eyes of his opponents, Paul was perceived as the negation of the ideal of an apostle. We see this like in a mirror image, because the whole discourse seems to be one great apologetic argument or counter-argument. Clearly, the apostle is referring to the charges directed against him. The adversaries undermine his authority by pointing out the colorlessness of his public speeches and the lack of his rhetorical abilities, his illness, and the many adversities that accompanied his apostolic activities. Evidently, his life doesn't reflect the ideal of a true theosanere, the apostle of Jesus Christ. On the contrary, the so-called false teacher must have had something to boast of and gained the applause in the Corinthian community, which eagerly sought spiritual sensations, as we know from the lecture of the 1 Corinthians. Thus, we can say that the passage analyzed here is a part of the argumentation used by Paul to show that he is a credible apostle of Christ indeed. It is a part of the larger section of the text, usually referred to as the fool's speech, where the apostle presents himself as a man almost out of his mind who intends to boast of himself. The Paul's story of the journey to the third heaven is located in a rhetorical unit that begins with verse 11:13. If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. And 12:10. Therefore I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardship, persecutions, calamities for the sake of Christ. Whenever I am weak, then I am strong. In verses 32 and 33, Paul tells of one of his weaknesses. He cites the story of his escape from Damascus. The fact of fleeing in a basket let down from the walls certainly doesn't bring the apostle pride. On the contrary, it is proof of his weakness. It seems to be a sort of self-ironic antithesis, anticipating as a counterpoint the story of the apostle's elevation up to the third heaven. Basket down, elevation up. In verse 12:1, Paul returns to the theme of boasting, but there is an element that may seem surprising to listeners. One may ask, why does the apostle introduce the theme of visions and revelations within the discourse on the boasting of weaknesses? By the way, it should be noted that he feels somehow compelled to bring up this subject. It is necessary to boast. One can suspect that this question was raised because it related to another criterion of apostolic credibility. The life of a true apostle of Christ should abound in supernatural visions and revelations. And it seems that Paul did not very readily or often spoke of such occurrences. The answer to how we can relate the description of Paul's heavenly journey with the theme of boasting about weaknesses will be found in the second part of the text, in verses 7 to 10. But for now, we will stop with the analysis of the first part of the passage. We can say that in verse 5, where we find the conclusion of the description of the journey, Paul indirectly answers how the description of his vision relates to the objections of the adversaries. The author decided to tell about an event that he can undoubtedly be proud of and which his opponents are not able to question. He tells the incredible story of his journey to the third heaven, which took place 14 years earlier, as he precisely mentions, probably following the example of the Old Testament prophets who lent credence to the historicity of the accounts, or perhaps to emphasize the unusual nature of the event, had the custom of giving the exact date of God's intervention in their lives. Then we can speak here of a rhetorical refutatio. which effectively rebuts the argument that the apostles had no visions or revelations. Thus, the context shows that the discourse of Paul's journey played a crucial rhetorical role in the passage. This is the English translation of the verses, but let's look at the Greek for a moment, because it is worth noting that verses 2 to 4 are, in keeping with Paul's technique of discourse, very symmetrically structured. Speaking of symmetry, it is worthwhile to consider the question which is sometimes raised, whether the passage speaks of one or two journeys of Paul. One to the third heaven, and second to the paradise, based on paradise. The problem arises, in my opinion, because most exegetes try to read Paul's text and other biblical texts as well in a linear mode, completely ignoring the specificity of style, which is based on concentric, symmetrical repetitions of linguistic elements in the microstructure, or ideas in the macrostructure. And as a result, Paul's style is sometimes described as irritating or incomprehensible. If we take into account the laws governing such symmetrical structures as parallelisms and chiasms, there is no doubt that we are dealing here with the so-called synthetic parallelism, in which the second element of the structure repeats the thought in question with a slight expansion. In this sense, the third heaven and paradise would be here the same reality. By the way, it is also worth noting that the third heaven is interpreted as paradise also in the Apocalypse of Paul, the apocryphal writing which was a development of the theme contained in the second Corinthians. The second problem with the description of Paul's unusual journey concerns the references to his physical condition at the time. The apostle writes that he didn't know whether everything happened ensomatic, in the body, or outside the somatic, outside the body, close to somatos, or without the body, horis to somatos. It is possible that paradoxically Paul will potentially admit all these possibilities simultaneously, and he is not concerned with detailed consideration of this problem, but with emphasizing the spectacular character of the event. His vision, it is easy to observe that his vision is different from other ancient visions of the hereafter. Paul tells us nothing about what he saw during his journey. We know he heard something, but he cannot tell us precisely what it was. He doesn't know more than he knows. The lack of the precision is a little bit puzzling. On the other hand, Paul writes precisely that he was taken into the third heaven. One way to explain the meaning of this expression involves the identification of a cosmological system that belonged to the worldview of the apostle and what follows also of the Corinthians. However, it is well known that within Judaism at the time there were various cosmological ideas that dealt with the structure of heaven. For instance, in the second book of Enoch, we find the concept of 7 heavens. Enoch traveled through 6 heavens to reach the highest heaven, where resided the Lord himself. In the Apocalypse of Abraham, we read of an 8th heaven. In other texts, we find references to 5 or even 10 heavens. Taking this into account, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to determine which of the cosmological system was close to Paul and to the Corinthians. The Corinthian church was a community which consisted of people of different origins, Jews, Gentiles. We can assume that they probably did not share a single cosmological system. Not all of them necessarily knew the content of the apocryphal text. It is therefore difficult to find here a common ground. However, we must assume that Paul wanted to be communicative, and in this specific polemical context, persuasive. Persuasiveness would be obtained by the reference to the spectacular nature of the event and its uniqueness. While going into complicated cosmological details could impress few experts on the subject. Therefore, it seems reasonable to look for other solutions to the mystery of the third heaven. We can assume that Paul may have wanted to tell his listeners that he was fortunate enough to reach the highest heaven, as evidenced by the use of the preposition heos, which suggests reaching a specific limit. In this context, it is worth noting the universal symbolic meaning of the number 3. It can be observed that this number appears very often in both the Old and New Testaments in a symbolic sense. The number 3 is a symbol of holiness, perfection, and fullness. We find the symbolic function of the 3 even in the passage analyzed here. I hope that we can see it. Yeah. In the verse 8, Paul writes that he asked God 3 times to take away from him his illness. The expression is taken literally only by few commentators. It is interesting that the symbolism of the 3 conceived in such a way seems to be a universal phenomenon. It appears in various complex places, times. In this context, it seems that Paul wanted to communicate to the Corinthians that he has reached the highest heaven, which is associated with the highest perfection. The use of this symbolic dimension of the number 3 would result in a message clearer to the audience than the appealing to complicated cosmological considerations. The cosmological discussion would have been set aside, and the Corinthians, and especially the opponents, the false teachers, would remain impressed by the vision that happens to the apostle. Maybe John Calvin seems to have been correct in his commentary on the 2 Corinthians when he writes that the number 3 is used here katexochen, prosummo et perfectissimo. In conclusion, I hypothesize that Paul might use here number 3 symbolically to describe paradise as a perfect place. One dimension of this perfection would be the blurring of the distinction between the purely corporeal and spiritual states of the person who is taken there. In this way, we could find here the element of the meeting or the union of the opposite realities. In this case, the dualism of body and soul is overcome. It reminds us of the union of the opposites that we observed in Williams' concept of the third heaven. Besides, Paul's disturbance of perception of the state raises the question of whether the apostle was talking about a journey to some place in space, or whether his vision was purely spiritual. Again, this would relate to the idea of the non-spatial third heaven, which is a potentially everywhere present reality in Williams' poems. If further research would confirm this interpretation, one might assume, contrary to Belzer, that some ideas about the third heaven might have been drawn by Williams directly from Paul's account of the heavenly journey in 2 Corinthians, as claimed Gracia Elliot. Thank you very much for